Mr. Clay. We keep this place running like clockwork. You won't regret a thing.
Hello there, I am Chris from the sixthaxis.com and I'm joined today by Taff. Say hello, Taff.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about Mafia III, which is obviously the third game in the Mafia series. And as you may have guessed for the name, it is slightly about organised crime. Would that be fair? Only slightly about organised crime?
I think a bit more than slightly, to be honest.
Mostly about organised.
Almost completely about organised crime, actually.
It would be an odd decision to go with that naming otherwise.
Yes, and then for it to be a dating sim.
Yeah, it would just be
I'd play that.
I would. But I would also feel tricked at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. So Mafia 3 is in the 60s, right?
Yeah, it's set in 1968.
And I assume we're going to expect a full-on like Austin Powers look to it, or are we going for more Mad Men, kind of slightly gritty realism type thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's neither of those two extremes. It's probably more Mad Men than Austin Powers. Definitely more Mad Men than Austin Powers. But it's got that vibe of the 1960s, and that's the most important thing about it. So you've got all the music. It looks like the 1960s. Actually, talking to the game director, I asked him about this, and he was just like, well, the 1960s wasn't all brown, but because that's what we see in film, that's what everybody expects. And so they've got a bit of that in the game, but not too much.
So the main character we've got here is Lincoln Clay. Tell us a little bit about the character. Like, is he just a very boring car, as his name would imply, or...?
It's not the best name, I don't think. And he kind of is a little bit dull. So it's a bit of a shame. But you first meet him when he's coming back from a tour in Vietnam, and he was in like special forces there as well. So he's a trained killer, and you see that all the way through the game quite vividly. But he, as a character, he was an orphan, and he's at this point returning to his kind of adopted family within the black mob. But at this time, you sort of see a jovial side, because he's got his friends, he's got his kind of family, but then all of that's ripped away from him in the first act. It's kind of like this one last job kind of story, and then the black mob gets betrayed, and he's like the last one left, and so from that point on, he's on this revenge trip, and then that defines his character. So really, the tricky thing that the game has to manage to do is build a story around him. And so really the colour and the interest in the story comes from seeing the bad guys. I mean, Lincoln Clay is in Black Mob, he is a bad guy, but you see the actual bad guys, the Italian mafia and the cronies of this group that you're trying to take down. And then the whole story is also wrapped up by interviews with Father James, who is kind of Lincoln's father figure and mentor and conscience almost as well. And you see these from years after the events of the game. And also then again there's another layer where you've got John Donovan, who is an accomplice to Lincoln's revenge trip, and he's in the middle of Senate hearings because he's actually a CIA agent and all of this stuff. So, yeah, there's a lot of layers to how the story is being wrapped up. I think that helps them leave Lincoln Clay as kind of being the boring Batman in the story, and you've got interesting people around him.
I mean, would you say as well, when you talk about Lincoln Clay being a bad guy versus the real bad guys, is this kind of quite nuanced in presentation? Are we talking shades of grey type thing?
Well, obviously, like the Italian mafia, they did the black mob in. Yeah. And so they are clearly completely bad guys. And the black mob weren't exactly goody two-shoes themselves. And so this is purely a revenge trip for Lincoln Clay. And it's kind of got this blaxploitation vibe going on, like Grindhouse films, or a kind of more modern reference would be Kill Bill, I guess. And like it's just someone's done him wrong and his people wrong, and so he's now on the mission to make them feel what he feels and just take everything down and dismantle the entire mafia in New Bordeaux.
That sounds really interesting, actually. Particularly, I like the elements of it being a revenge trip, but even so, he's still not a good guy, and it seems like it makes it quite clear that he's not a good guy throughout, which is, I mean, you get that in games reasonably frequently, but I don't know if I've seen it presented quite like this before.
Yeah, so I mean, what actually happens is that as you take control of an area of a district from the mafia, you're then putting your own lieutenants in and taking over the sex and prostitution in one area, or the racketeering in another, the drug trade somewhere else, that kind of thing. So you're not a good guy. Definitely not a good guy. You're just taking over their turf and taking over their business.
What about the city itself? Is this in a real city or are we somewhere fictional?
So it's called New Bordeaux, and it is quite obviously based on New Orleans. But it's taking liberties with like the layout and everything around it. But you've got all of the kind of iconic areas. You've got the Bayou, the swamps, the kind of glitzier downtown. You've got the upper class mansions where there's lots of really, really lush greenery and stuff like that. And then you've also got the downtrodden lower class areas, which is where the black mob resides to start off with, and things like this. And also they get the music right. So it's not just that you've got 1960s period music, and there is one hell of a soundtrack in this game, which is all licensed and stuff. So you're not actually going to hear any of it in the background of this video. And it's kind of a shame that you only actually hear that when you're in a car, really, because it's just like you'll turn it on, you'll just be like, oh yeah, this is 1960s, it's fantastic. But then you've also got like people just playing trumpet and playing jazz in the corner of a bar, playing whatever. And so they get that music right, and that really adds to the feeling of the city, I think, definitely.
That's pretty cool. Seems like they've gone to real effort to go for the authenticity here, which is nice.
Yeah, definitely. But obviously they know that they're a game, and so they can play around with stuff as well.
Particularly when they're doing it as a fictionalized city rather than actual New Orleans.
Yeah, absolutely.
It gives them that little bit more freedom. You talked in your Gamescom preview about the violence in the game. Does it really feel violent? That you've gone hands-on with it, etc.?
I have to say yes.
I mean, compared to games like GTA as well.
Well, I mean, there's always player agency in the violence.
Yeah.
So you can drive badly and drive down the pavement of a street and mow down like 15 people, and that's up to you. But I think in terms of the actual combat systems and the kind of finishing moves that you have, those are, for me, very, very brutal and violent. And it's actually kind of strange because to go for non-lethal takedowns, you have to go into the menu and change an option so that you go from lethal to non-lethal. And basically what this does is it means that Lincoln isn't running around with a Bowie knife and stabbing people in the neck. But it is still very violent. It's, again, I'm going to talk about Batman. It's the kind of thing where in Batman games, like he's breaking limbs and like dislocating shoulders left, right, and centre. And these are things that are going to, like, if you think about the long-term consequences of this, these are things that are going to affect that person for years to come.
For sure.
So when Lincoln's non-lethal takedown sees him knock a guy to the floor and then curb stomp him, like just smack, like
that's only non-lethal under the, like, yeah, you didn't kill the guy, but
yeah, exactly. That's what I mean about Batman as well. So yeah, it's a violent game, but you can. Yeah, I don't know. It depends on how you play the game as well. Like if you're going for just gunfights as well, then it's a kind of different tone. But also, if you're going for a stealthier approach, then there's a lot more up close and personal. And I think for me, you kind of see it a bit more.
So how does it run on PS4? And are they doing anything for the PlayStation Pro? Obviously, now that we know that that's coming.
Yeah, so for the standard PlayStation 4, I think it actually runs pretty well. I didn't really notice too much frame dropping, but that's not really something that goes into my head too much. What I did notice was that, like, you can see the textures not loading in, but the level of detail is actually quite close to you when you're driving around. And also, there's stuff like I really quite like the rain effect, but it adds an extra layer of graininess to the sky, which.
And if they're going for that kind of pulp feel to it anyway.
Yeah, there's an element of that, but I think it's kind of a mixture of that and having to find a way to get it to run well on the PS4. But then as for the PS4 Pro, they're not ready to talk about it yet. I did ask, but they will have something to say between now and the console's release, and maybe even the game's release, which is in October. But I did pass on that they should definitely aim for the kind of Rise of the Tomb Raider approach, which lets players choose between having a 4K upscale checkerboarding, all of this stuff, or having 1080p with more detail, or having 1080p with a higher frame rate. So just having those kind of things.
I think that's kind of the approach I think everyone has to go for.
Yeah, I think exclusives, it's a different matter. because you don't have the PC version in the background. With Mafia 3, you do have the PC version, and so they've got that upper tier of quality and all the settings that they can flick up. So they've got that, and hopefully that's what they're going to do.
So this is coming out in October, right?
Yep, it's out on October 7th, and as you'd expect, it's PS4, Xbox One, and as I just said, PC.
Awesome. So obviously you've seen this video now. We also have a written preview of the game from Gamescom and a new written preview based on this playthrough. So you can check all of that out at thesixaxis.com. I've been Chris, I've been joined by Tef, and thanks for watching, guys. Bye.
Goodbye.
All area units, please respond. Report of an altercation in the French Ward. Suspect described as a Negro male. Dispatch out.
Get out here! Bad one, boys! Yes! We got ourselves a guest!
Here he is! Give me a hand!
Officer requests assistance. All units.
Watch how you driving, man!
All units. Suspect has entered a vehicle.